I'll be reading a poem written by Chelan Harkin. That's Chelan. It's from her poetry book called Susceptible to Light. The worst thing we ever did was put God in the sky, out of reach, pulling the divinity from belief, sifting out the holy from our bones, insisting God isn't bursting dazzlement. Through everything we've made a hard commitment to see as ordinary, stripping the sacred from everywhere to put in a cloud, man elsewhere. Prying closeness from your heart. The worst thing we ever did was take the dance and the song out of prayer. Made it sit up straight, cross its legs, removed it of rejoicing, wiped clean its hip sway, its questions, its ecstatic yowl, its tears. The worst thing we ever did is pretend God isn't the easiest thing in this universe, available to every soul in every breath. Amen.
I kind of liked the light you shined on Christopher last week, and I was hoping for that. However, since you've already said you don't want to go back outside with the flies, it's an interesting view from here. I've known all but you, I guess, David, since you was knee-high to a bullfrog. Spiritually, that is. And we've grown some, and we've not grown some, and we've shared some, and we've lost some. And this morning, I wished I hadn't asked Mary and Jane and David to sing Let There Be Peace on Earth, because I could think about was so... I can't think of his name. Becky and John's son, the singer, Tim.
Mason.
Mason, thank you. I was thinking of it then, and how absolutely mesmerizing his voice was out of the silence, singing that, and how much I believed in the possibility of peace. But it has to begin with us. Hence, my message this morning, which may seem to have little or nothing to do with Let There Be Peace on Earth, maybe not even morning has broken, but it has to do with us, with the church. 10 or 12 years ago, Carolyn and I went to Atlanta, especially to see the aquarium. Carolyn drove. I'm looking to see if she remembers what story I'm about to tell. And my job as we got closer to our destination was to navigate. Interstate 85 around Atlanta is quite frankly quite scary. And we didn't want to miss our turn. And Lord knows where we would have ended up, the Gulf of Mexico maybe. When we were almost there, I began giving Carolyn the names or numbers of our possible exits that we could take so we could get to where we were going. For a few minutes, she complied with my guidance quite well. But you know Carolyn. She started questioning me. I had it wrong, she insisted, even though I was the one with the map. She got more confused, bless her heart. and kept telling me I wasn't making any sense. Now, I had been told that before, and so I kind of ignored it. Because she was driving, though, I didn't want to make too much of a fuss. I didn't want her to get mad with me. The Lord knows what she'd have done. So I just suggested, well, let's just take the next exit and we'll see what's what.
Uh-oh.
So, as she slowed to take the exit, Carolyn glanced at the map I was holding. "Judith," she yelled, "you've got the map upside down. We're getting into Atlanta from the north, not the south." She was right, damn it. I was looking for Atlanta in all the wrong places. I was upside down, and therefore so was Carolyn. All I had to do was turn the map. So east was east and west was west. And we got to where we intended to go in time for what I remember as a very good and very expensive supper. I think we should have called it dinner before bedtime. Enough about Carolyn. Back in the summer, I was looking in Matthew's gospel for something I've now forgotten what on earth it was. I don't often search for something in Matthew's gospel or anywhere else, really. And so I came across the passage in which Peter, when the disciples were asked by Jesus who they thought he was, said very piously, "You are the Son of God. You are the Messiah." Oh, that reading, though, both the question and the answer seemed contrived. Peter, holier than holy? Jesus asking foolish questions? He asked questions, but they weren't always foolish, were they? What was his point? These were his disciples, and they'd been with him. I mean, he hadn't picked them up last night. So they were with him and surely had some idea of who they were following. And Peter, I did a poor imitation of trying to get him to speak the words with any degree of piety and seriousness. So I had to turn the map right side up. I was looking at it from the wrong direction. So I stopped asking Jesus or Peter what they were trying to do and began to ask, what if they had succeeded? Now, what they were trying to do was what Matthew was trying to do was establish that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, it's a good thing, and I want you all to do it every day of your lives. It's a good thing to remember imagination, image. The ones who wrote down the creation stories said we all are created in God's image. Image has something to do with imagination. So listen, imagination is not pretense. It is an act of creation, or in this case, co-creation. Because I'm not making up a story out of whole cloth. Me and Matthew and Peter and Jesus and God and Mary and David and Jane, we're all in it together. And you? But in that moment that never really happened, because after all, there were no video cameras on cell phones back then, David, and so even if there had been, we might not have gotten the full story had that moment actually happened. What very well could have resulted had it had happened, and had Peter said yes when Jesus said, oh, I forgot that part. Jesus said, "Who do you think I am?" And Peter, being Peter, jumped up and just said, "You're the Messiah, for goodness sakes. Don't you know who you are? You're the Messiah, the Son of God." And what did Jesus say? He said, "Peter, you are going to lead the church when I no longer can. And here, I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom." In other words, Jesus, then Peter, and then it was up for grabs. If it had happened that way, what we might have had is a church that celebrates, not denies, our humanity. Peter and Jesus met with mutual affirmation. Peter said, "You are the Messiah." Jesus said, "I want you to lead my people when I'm no longer here." And there is a depth of meaning that I have not yet seen in any of the references I have looked at for more than a few months, for 30 years. But maybe it's there, maybe I just don't know it yet. I think it's trivialized when the interpreters of that scripture say, okay, Jesus is the Messiah. Up to heaven he goes to sitteth on the right hand of God the Father Almighty, from whence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead. That understanding is convenient for a church which seems not to care too much about humankind, not to believe in the sanctity of all of life as we Quakers do. In that line, Jesus gets to heaven to sit on the right hand of God the Father Almighty and what? And wait until the saved, what a horrible phrase, till the saved trickle into heaven, leaving the burden of earthly existence behind. But what if? I love what if. What if it really were a story not about Jesus going to heaven and waiting for the saved, but what if it were a story about mutuality, about vulnerability, and about intimacy? A story of two people, it didn't have to be men, women, two people who in an unexpected moment met with a common experience, a common question, a common answer, and they knew each other. Knew in the sense of gnosis, this kind of knowing, not this kind of knowing, not cognition. If we're lucky, we all experience such moments once or twice in a lifetime, where we know that somebody gets us, understands us, at least for that moment. It would be rare indeed if it were perpetual. And people who are married and say they've never had an argument, you kind of wonder about that. But every now and then, we have a flash of being understood, of being known, and of being accepted. Now, as I said, the interpretation takes nothing from Jesus. In fact, it honors his full humanity, just like an early church council proclaimed Jesus was fully human and fully divine. And he was probably more fully human than the church council members may have been, probably, since they, like most people on committees or in groups, intimate groups or small groups, They don't really trust that they can be who they are, that they can say, you're the Christ, for goodness sakes. You're the Messiah. For fear of embarrassment. You notice the other disciples didn't say it. They kind of were looking around like, oh, please don't call on me. Jesus saying yes to Peter's proclamation, and Peter saying yes to Jesus' question, and presumably that, sure, Jesus, I'll take on that role. You give me the keys. I think we already kind of know what they are, and I'll do that for you. Now, I've been struggling with finding a way to illustrate this very important understanding of verses that rarely get the attention I've given. I think you all know what I'm talking about, but I finally came up with an illustration that I'm going to be kind of like Papa Joe. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, even if I've told you before, because I kind of like to hear it again myself. When I was with Luke and Caleb this summer, we had such an experience, and I'm going to call it a grandmama, an aria, a boy, and a ha. When I was with them, we waited until almost too late to bake our pound cake. We always bake a pound cake. This was the day before I was coming home. Now, frankly, I think by then we were a little tired of one another. I mean, they're 12 and 14. They're not 6 and 8 anymore, so Grandma's adorableness wears off quick. So there we were in the kitchen, measuring ingredients, and they were being, of all things, adolescent boys. Now that's just inexcusable at that time of day. At the end of my visit, they should have done better. So I was fed up, and I raised my voice and said firmly, Alexa, play Pavarotti singing Nessun Dorma. And then I turned to my sweet grandsons and said, if either of you even breathe loudly while this is playing, I'll chop you into bits and mix you in this pound cake and feed it to the dog. Well, you can imagine they were just terrified. But at least for about the 3 minutes of the magnificent music, they were quiet. And the cake got baked without any foreign bodies that I know of, partially eaten, and all was well. Now that night, on our way back to the motel, we stayed at Tim and Dawn's house for most of the time, but I was sleeping at the motel, and they stayed with me there several nights. So on the way back to the motel, I, without announcing it this time, played Pavarotti singing Nessun Dorma on my car stereo, call it stereos. And on the hill below Tim's, it's not a country road by any means, but not highly trafficked, and it's dark because down there down that end of the hill, people don't have street lights. And as the swelling began to swell in that incredible music, I did what I always do, even though I was driving. I didn't slow the car, and I raised my arms, and I breathed in all that was beauty and wonderful and good, and I was doing about like I am now. And when the music ended, I turned it off and I didn't say a word. I had already made my point earlier. Caleb, my 12-year-old, was sitting in the front seat and with me, passenger seat, and he said, Grandmama, is opera the kind of music you can like even if you don't understand the words? And I thought, wow, that's a pretty good way of expressing how I feel about it. And then we were quiet again. And after another moment, he said, "It is kind of neat, isn't it?" He got it. It is kind of neat, isn't it? Now, I shudder to think what the church might have done to Peter had he actually have been named Pope when it was safe to be a Christian, some 300 years after he and Jesus had both been martyred, and so had many others. We can see how the papacy and the priesthood were forced into mystery, hiding in great stone cathedrals with secret passages, priests covered with robes from neck to ankle or foot that just flowed so that nothing that would be embarrassing, like a bulge or a bump or whatever, would indicate that there was a human being under that robe, whose authority was so very absolute that few could have sought it anyway. And besides, it was not given necessarily to the wise, but to those who could read, and in Latin, no less. Those were the priests and the popes and all those people. And then there was the secrecy within the mystery that was so profound that were a priest or a pope ever to sin, as human beings sometimes do, there would be no shame nor embarrassment, as the sin would be hidden within the church. Had Peter been interviewed for that job, he'd have laughed all the way to the exit door. Those guys were trying the impossible, he would have said. Goodness, he would have said, can't you let humans be human? Did God create mistakes? Of course, it was not only the clergy, all men, whose humanity was forced into hiding by the church, who claimed Jesus as its leader. Women, too, were scrutinized for their own outrageous humanity. They were female, yuck. They bled, yuck. And there were only two kinds of women after all. The good kind, like the Virgin Mary. It's kind of hard to keep a population going if everybody's a virgin, you know? And then, of course, the other end of the spectrum, the fallen woman, the prostitute, the harlot. And the church named Mary Magdalene. I said I'm not making this up, I'm being creative. They made that up. There is nothing in the Bible to indicate that Magdalene was a harlot. But, so there were these absolute boundaries between good and bad, good and evil, right and wrong. Of course, I guess we can't blame the ancient church for all of it, since a similar scene is being played out in Texas, isn't it? Women as less than second-class citizens. No, our Peter wouldn't have made it as a priest or a pope or a Texas legislator or even a North Carolina legislator, it seems. Since the church rejected Jesus, and I believe the church did reject Jesus from the get-go, it's hard to imagine it could have accepted Peter. So we have to turn that map upside down again. Carolyn, where are you? What would Peter's church have been like? Very much what Jesus' church would have been like. Fully human, fully alive, unlikely to focus on sin and all its possible permutations, because it would be celebrating the human creatures made in God's image. No original sin, no doctrine so bizarre that some, including a Sunday school, that's Muncie, Indiana, by the way, that I'm pointing to, a Sunday school teacher in Muncie, told his 13-year-old little girl's Sunday school class that something happened when babies are born, that they're okay in the womb, and then when they're born, they go through this sin storm and are born sinners. Now that was interesting to try to undo. Peter's church, like Jesus' church, would be much simpler than what church in the early days turned out to be. Like Jesus, Peter and his successors would baptize babies not to save them, for goodness sakes, but just so they could hold them. The church would have both men and women leaders. The church would not teach fear, but would demonstrate love. The church would celebrate life and would know God as source of love and of life. And Jesus as the fullest example of both. The church would celebrate life, would embody love. That would be Peter's church. It'd be kind of neat, wouldn't it?
Please pray with me one more time as I read this poem again. The worst thing we ever did was put God in the sky, out of reach, pulling the divinity from the leaf, sifting out the holy from our bones, insisting God isn't bursting dazzlement through everything we've made a hard commitment to see as ordinary, stripping the sacred from everywhere to put in a cloud, man elsewhere, prying closeness from your heart. The worst thing we ever did was take the dance and the song out of prayer, made it sit up straight, cross its legs, removed it of rejoicing, wiped clean its hip sway, its questions, its ecstatic yowl, its tears. The worst thing we ever did is pretend God isn't the easiest thing in this universe, available to every soul in every breath. Amen.